Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see everybody. As you know, we're approaching the Passover. In fact, tomorrow evening, after sunset, we will be observing the Passover. And by the way, we will be observing it here in this same location. In considering the Passover, it's most important that we understand the spiritual lessons behind it. It's not just an exercise in some traditional ritual that has no real significance, but it should have deep significance. And as we keep the Passover, we should clearly have in mind what its significance is. God has used history and religious symbolism to weave a pattern of spiritual instruction for us to learn. And part of that is the Passover. And today I want to discuss the Passover and its symbolism and lessons in detail. Now, I'm not going to be saying everything that could be said about the Passover, but we do need to consider, as we approach the Passover, what it actually means. Let's turn over to Exodus 12. Exodus 12, and we'll read here about the Passover as it was first instituted among the Israelites. And this was at a time when the people of Israel were in Egypt, and they had been made into slaves of the Egyptians there. And in Exodus 12, verse 1, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, On the 10th day of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household." And so this was done at a particular time of year, the first month, which occurred in the spring. And on the 10th day of the month, a lamb was to be taken for each household. And in verse 4 it says, "If the household is too small for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of the persons. According to each man's need, you shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. Now you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight. And they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses where they eat it. Then they shall eat the flesh on that night, roasted in fire with unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat it raw, nor boiled at all with water, but roasted in fire, its head with its legs and its entrails. You shall let none of it remain until morning, and what remains of it until morning you shall burn with fire. And thus you shall eat it with a belt on your waist, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. So you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord," or the Eternal, as it could be translated, which is really a better translation than Lord, because that's what the Hebrew word essentially means, the Eternal One, or ever-living One. Verse 13, "Now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." So these were the instructions God gave to Moses to relay to the people of Israel concerning the Passover, when it was to be kept, and the details about its keeping in terms of the sacrifice and the meal that was to be eaten in keeping the Passover. In verse 21, then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, pick out and take lambs for yourselves according to your families, and kill the Passover lamb. And you shall take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and strike the lintel and the 2 doorposts with the blood that is in the basin, and none of you shall go out of the door of his house until morning. For the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and not allow the destroyer to come into your houses to strike you. And you shall observe this thing as an ordinance for you and your sons forever. It will come to pass when you come to the land which the Lord will give you, just as he promised, that you shall keep this service. And it shall be when your children say to you, what do you mean by this service? That you shall say, it is the Passover sacrifice of the Lord, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt, when he struck the Egyptians and delivered our household. So the people bowed their heads and worshipped. Then the children of Israel went away and did so, just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. So they did, and it came to pass at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of livestock. So Pharaoh rose in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. So the instructions were given concerning the sacrifice of the Passover lamb. The Israelites did do as Moses had instructed them. And then at midnight, or in the middle of the night, on the night of the Passover, this would have been after the Passover meal had been eaten, after the lamb, of course, had been killed, which was killed at twilight. And the specific meaning of the Hebrew term translated twilight is between the period from sunset to dark. So it was killed on the 14th after sunset. It was not killed in the middle of the afternoon on the 14th. It was killed at twilight between sunset and dark on the 14th and eaten at night on the 14th, not the 15th, as is common among most Jews today. They actually eat, they don't actually eat a Passover lamb. They don't sacrifice the Passover lamb anymore because of the fact there is no proper place to sacrifice it, but they do eat their Passover meal on the evening of the 15th instead of the 14th, as was commanded by God. But we keep the fast Passover on the evening of the 14th because that's when God said to keep it. And it's interesting that according to Jewish tradition, and there are many things in Jewish tradition that are not necessarily reliable or can be taken at face value, but it is a fact that according to Jewish tradition, the 10th day of the month, at the time the first Passover was kept, the 10th day was a Sabbath. That is according to Jewish tradition. And if so, that it's interesting that would correspond with the weekday order of events at the time that Jesus was sacrificed, the 10th day, then being on a Sabbath, and the Passover being on Tuesday evening, the 14th, during at the time that Christ was crucified in that particular year. The word Passover is from the Hebrew Pesach, which means to skip, or to step, or to leap over, or to pass over. And this is where our English term Passover originates, is from the Hebrew word which means to pass over. And it relates to what happened on that night, where the Passover or the death angel passed over the homes of the Israelites when the plague of death was being visited upon the Egyptians, and the firstborn of each household was taken by God, claimed by God. The death angel passed over the homes protected by the blood of the Lamb, which was smeared on the doorposts and lintels of the doors. Now, we read that bitter herbs were eaten with the Passover lamb, and the bitter herbs were, like all of the details in the Passover meal, were symbolic, and the bitter herbs themselves were symbolic of the bitterness of the bondage in which the Egyptians had become entangled as slaves. We read about that over in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 14, the kind of slavery that the people were suffering. And we might go back to verse 13. It says, the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor. And in the margin of my Bible here, the word rigor could also be rendered harshness. So this was a very harsh servitude that the Israelites were being forced to endure, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, as it goes on to explain, in mortar and brick and in all manner of service in the field. All their service in which they made them serve was with rigor. Now, slavery has been endemic in society virtually from as far back in history as we can go with how societies were organized. And throughout most of history, actually, the majority of human beings have been in bondage of one sort or another, and relatively few people over the course of history have been actually free of bondage and slavery. But there are different types of slavery, different levels of bondage. And in recent times, we might think of World War II. If you've studied much history of World War II, you probably know that the Nazis, for example, enslaved millions of people, made them slaves, and caused them to work in various types of bondage, producing war goods or producing other things. And many of those people actually died from the conditions that they had to endure. They were often beaten. They were subjected to random killings. They were starved. They endured the ravages of living without proper sanitation in many cases, overcrowding, and not being properly protected from the elements. Those were some of the things that they endured. Beatings and things of that sort. Not that much different was the plight of millions of people, many tens of millions of people who were enslaved in the Soviet Union in the 20th century. And these are just a couple of examples of the kind of slavery that has been endured by people even in recent times. There are many people even today that are having to endure slavery, including even in our own nation. There are estimated to be tens of thousands of people, for example, even in the United States today, who are enslaved either as sex slaves, forced into prostitution, or forced into various kinds of labor. And it's not only in the United States, but many other places in the world. It's estimated by the U.S. government that there may be as many as 30 million people in the world today that are in literal slavery. And depending on how you define slavery, there may be many more than that. But the kind of slavery that the Israelites were enduring was not a pleasant way of life. It was not a rewarding or happy way of life. It was misery. And they were suffering. And their children were being killed, as is explained elsewhere in the book of Exodus. So the bitter herbs were intended to remind the people of Israel of the bitterness of their condition. Now, the slavery that the people of Israel were enduring from a spiritual standpoint is typical and emblematic of slavery to sin, which the whole world has endured. Every human being who draws breath, if he has lived long enough, has sinned except Jesus Christ. Now, little babies are not born with sin. They're born innocent. But it doesn't take long before sin is committed as we grow older, and especially as we come to the age of accountability. Every human being has sinned, and every human being has become enslaved to one degree or another to sin. Over in 1 Peter chapter 4, Peter writes in verse 1, "Therefore, since Christ suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same mind, for he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin." And what this means is not necessarily just that you suffer, but you suffer imitating Christ's sufferings, overcoming sin, and being perhaps persecuted as a consequence of serving God. And that's what Christ's suffering was about. It was about being persecuted because he obeyed God. That he no longer should live the rest of his life in the flesh for the lusts of men, but for the will of God. For we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles, when we walked in lewdness, lusts, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable practices. And this pretty much sums up the way of life among Gentiles at the time that Peter wrote this epistle, especially to the people in the area where he was writing. This was how their society was structured around such activities, and it's not that different from the rest of the world, including our society today. And in verse 4, he says, "In regard to these, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you." So this is an example of what the bondage in which the Israelites were engaged is representative of, symbolic of, from a spiritual standpoint. Being enslaved to sin, being enmeshed in a life of sin, which is characteristic of the world society, which virtually everyone is subject to. And so, being liberated from that involves our separating ourselves from it, as the Israelites were separated from their bondage in Egypt.